This is Miss Anna, and I want to begin the way I always begin when the topic is one that people have decided is too dangerous to discuss honestly. With a commitment to your actual well-being over your immediate comfort, because those two things are not always the same. In fact, on the topics that matter most, on the choices that shape the direction of a life in ways that compound quietly over years before they become impossible to ignore, comfort and well-being are often in direct opposition to each other. Comfort says, do not say that. Do not name it. Do not trace the line between the choice and the consequence, because tracing that line makes people feel judged, and feeling judged is the worst thing we are apparently allowed to cause anyone anymore. Well-being says something different. Well-being says, the woman who is 32 right now, making choices she has not examined honestly, inside a framework she was handed by people who prioritized her agreement over her clarity, deserves accurate information about what is waiting for her at 35 and 40 and 45 if the pattern continues. She deserves the conversation, not the comfortable version, the true one. I am going to have it, not because I enjoy difficulty, because the alternative is watching women arrive at places they never intended to reach and act surprised by the landscape, when the landscape was always the destination of the road they were on. You deserved this conversation earlier. Consider this better late than never. Let me begin by being precise about what I mean, because precision is respect, and vagueness is how people avoid accountability while appearing to say something. I am not talking about a woman who had a difficult season, who went through something painful and made choices in the aftermath that she would make differently now, who experienced a period of her life where she was figuring herself out, and the figuring involved people and situations she would not choose with the clarity she has now. That is not what I am describing. I am describing a pattern, a sustained, chosen, ongoing approach to intimacy that treats it as recreation without consequence. That moves through people with the specific quality of someone who has decided that connection is a commodity that can be acquired cheaply and discarded without cost, and replaced with the next one without anything meaningful being lost in the exchange. That pattern, sustained over years, running through a woman's 20s and into her 30s, that is what I want to talk about today, and what it produces. Specifically, honestly, and without the softening that would let her feel better about this in the moment while leaving her exactly where she is. The first consequence is one she will not find on any list, because it does not arrive with a label. It arrives as a feeling, a specific, quiet, persistent feeling that something that used to be available to her is no longer quite accessible, not gone entirely, just behind glass, visible from where she is standing but not quite reachable in the way it used to be reachable. That thing is the full weight of connection. Here is what I mean by that. Intimacy between two people who are genuinely invested in each other is not simply a physical event. It is a transfer, an opening of something that is ordinarily protected, a moment of genuine vulnerability that, when it is real, produces a specific kind of closeness that has no substitute and no shortcut. The nervous system knows this. The part of a human being that registers connection and attachment and the specific safety of being genuinely known by another person, that part is not neutral about intimacy. It assigns meaning. It builds associations. It responds to each experience with a sensitivity calibrated to what the experience actually costs the person having it. Except that sensitivity is not fixed. It responds to training. A woman who has moved through a sustained pattern of casual intimacy has been training her nervous system consistently and thoroughly. She has been teaching it that this particular experience means nothing, that it carries no weight, that the opening it represents is not actually an opening because there is nothing particularly vulnerable about what is happening. And the nervous system, which is an obedience student, learns exactly what it is taught. So, by the time she is 35, and she meets a man she actually wants, a man she genuinely wants to build something real with, something is different. The depth that intimacy is supposed to produce does not quite arrive. The emotional gravity that should accompany genuine vulnerability has been lightened by repetition until it barely registers. She reaches for the feeling and finds a version of it, a thinner version, a version that is recognizable but not quite the same as the thing she is reaching for. She experiences this as him not being right, as the connection not being there, as the relationship not having the depth she was hoping for. She does not connect it to herself. She does not trace the line between what she trained and what she can now access. The line is direct. The training worked exactly as training works. What she practiced, she became, and she became very efficient at intimacy that costs nothing. And efficiency at costless things produces an inability to access the version that costs something, because cost is the mechanism by which depth is produced. That is the first consequence. Quiet, invisible from the outside, carried entirely on the inside. And building long before 35 into a deficit she will not fully understand until she needs the capacity she spent years diminishing. The second consequence involves something that serious men are looking for and that the pattern systematically works against. I want to be careful here because this section is the one most likely to be misread as a claim about purity or a number or some external measure that a man is checking against his own standards. That is not what I am describing. What I am describing is something internal, a quality, an orientation toward the self and the relationship that is either present or it is not, and that a man who is serious about building something can sense with a precision that does not require information he was explicitly given. The quality is settledness. A woman who is settled knows who she is independent of whether she is being chosen. Her sense of her own value is not recalculated with every new interaction. She is not oriented toward the constant affirmation of her own desirability as a primary organizing principle of her life. She has a relationship with her own interior that is stable enough to sustain genuine intimacy rather than requiring it as a form of self-confirmation. The pattern I am describing works directly against this quality because the pattern is, at its core, an attention economy. Each new encounter produces a fresh confirmation. She is still desirable. She is still chosen. She is still the woman that men want. And when that confirmation becomes the mechanism by which she experiences her own worth, its absence becomes intolerable. She needs the next one to feel what she felt after the last one. And the man who wants to offer her something lasting, who wants to build something that has depth and history and the particular richness of two people who have chosen each other consistently over time, cannot compete with the chemistry of novelty. He is a different proposition entirely. He is offering something that requires the settledness she does not currently have. So she does not choose him, or she chooses him and cannot stay. Or she stays and is restless. In a way neither of them can name. After 35, the options that produce the confirmation begin to thin, not disappear. Thin, the encounters become less frequent. The gaps between them longer. And the woman who built her sense of herself on a foundation of being consistently chosen by new people begins to experience something she has no framework for. Because the framework she was given did not include this part. The part where the market shifts and the confirmation becomes less available, and the internal architecture that was supposed to be built from something other than external validation turns out not to have been built at all. Nobody told her to build it. They told her to enjoy her freedom. They called the confirmation liberation. They gave her language for the choosing, and no language for the cost of what the choosing was consuming. The third consequence is a specific loneliness that is very difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it. It is not the ordinary loneliness of being without a partner. That loneliness is painful, but it has a clear shape. It is the absence of a specific thing: company, companionship, someone to call, someone who knows how your day went and cares about the answer. This is a different loneliness, deeper and harder to locate. The loneliness of having been physically known by many people and genuinely known by almost none of them. Genuine knowing requires time. It requires sustained presence across enough ordinary moments that a real picture of who you are begins to form in another person. Not who you are on a good evening, when you are interesting and attractive and performing the version of yourself that new situations tend to produce. Who you are at 11 on a Tuesday when you are tired and uncertain and not trying to be anything for anyone. The pattern does not produce that. The encounters are self-contained by design. The connection exists in a sealed compartment that opens for an evening and closes permanently. Both people leave essentially unknown to each other, and both of them remain essentially unknown. Do that enough times and you develop a specific relationship with your own interior life. You become expert at surface, at the performance of yourself that works in the early stages of connection before the early stages are required to become something more sustained. The surface gets very polished, and what is behind the surface gets less and less practice at being seen. After 35, the loneliness of this becomes harder to manage. The life from the outside can look full: experiences, stories, a social presence that reads as confident and self-sufficient. And she is lonely in a way she cannot explain to the people around her because explaining it would require naming things she is not ready to name. That the freedom she was celebrating was also a flight. That some of what she called independence was avoidance dressed in better language. That the connection she was getting was a rehearsal for the connection she actually needed, and the rehearsal ran so long it started to feel like the real thing until she looked for the real thing and could not find it. 35 has a way of making what was working stop working, not all at once. Gradually, the way tides shift, and when it stops working, the loneliness that was always underneath it is suddenly in the room without anything between her and it. The fourth consequence is biological, and I am going to say it plainly because plainness is honesty, and honesty is what this conversation requires. The body has a timeline, not a moral timeline, a biological one, a physical reality that exists independent of anyone's feelings about it, and independent of how inconvenient it is, and independent of how many times people have been told that the timeline is flexible and they have as much time as they need. They do not have as much time as they need. That is not a punishment. It is biology. A woman who arrives at her mid-30s having spent her prime years inside a pattern of casual intimacy rather than building toward something lasting is now navigating a landscape with less biological margin than she started with. If she wants children, the window is narrower than it was. If she wants a partner who also wants children, she is now in conversation with men who are aware of that narrowing and whose own timelines interact with hers in ways that create a pressure that did not exist at 25. The men she now wants, the ones who are established and mature and genuinely ready to build something, have been building. While she was in the pattern, many of those men found women who were ready earlier, women who knew what they wanted and were available to receive it when it arrived. He is not unavailable, but the version of him that was completely unattached and unhurried is less available than he was a decade ago. This is not irreversible. I want to say that clearly because I am not here to produce despair, and I am not here to tell any woman that her story is finished. Women have built genuine and full lives, real partnerships, real families after this point. Not as consolation prizes, as real things, but it is harder. The margin for the unhurried discovery of what you want is smaller. The decisions that felt theoretical at 25 have become concrete And the woman who was told she had unlimited time was given the most expensive lie available in a life. Time is the one thing that does not return. Not at any price. Not with any effort. The years of the pattern are years that were spent in a direction. And the woman standing at 35 does not get to go back and spend them differently. She only gets to decide what she does with what is in front of her now. The fifth consequence is the reckoning, and this is the one that nobody warns her about because warning her would require admitting what the framework was doing to her all along. At some point, usually quietly, usually in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones, the story she told herself about the pattern begins to show its seams. The story was different for different women. For some, it was freedom, the refusal to be constrained by expectations built for a different generation, the reclaiming of something, the living of a life on terms she set rather than terms she inherited. For others, it was not readiness. She was not ready for something real yet. She was still becoming, still finding herself, still doing the work that needed to be done before she could show up fully in a genuine partnership. For others, it was standards. She had them. She was not going to lower them. The fact that no one she encountered ever quite measured up was evidence of her discernment and her refusal to settle, rather than evidence of anything that required examination on her part. These stories are not all lies. There is often something real in them, but they are also armor. And the reckoning is what happens when the armor gets too heavy to keep wearing. It arrives in specific moments. At the wedding of a friend where she is genuinely happy for the people getting married and also feeling something she cannot name that sits alongside the happiness and will not leave. At a family dinner where the questions about her life have a new quality to them. Not cruel, just weighted. Weighted with the awareness that certain windows are narrowing, and she can feel the weight even though no one is saying it directly. At night, alone, in a life that belongs entirely to her with the freedom still technically intact, and she sits with the story and turns it over and begins to see the places where what she told herself and what she actually felt did not quite match. The choices she called liberation that were also flights from something she was afraid to want out loud. That reckoning is not comfortable, but it is the most useful thing that has happened to her in years, because it is the first honest conversation she has had with herself about any of this. And honest conversations are the only ones that open doors to something different. The women who have the reckoning honestly, who sit with it without excusing themselves too quickly and without destroying themselves with shame, who hold the full picture and decide what they want to do with what remains, those women build something real on the other side of it, not despite having had the reckoning. Because of it, here is what I want every woman hearing this to receive before she decides how to respond to it. If this found you early, you are holding something valuable. The ability to look at a direction and change it while there is time and margin and the full range of choices still available. Not from panic. From clarity. If this found you in the middle of the pattern, it is not too late to build a different relationship with yourself and with what intimacy means to you. That building is slow. It does not produce immediate results, but trajectory changes. And a changed trajectory, held consistently, arrives somewhere different than the original one would have. And if this found you on the other side, sitting with a life the pattern produced and the reckoning I described sitting in the room with you, I want to say this as clearly as I know how to say it. You are not finished. You are not beyond the reach of something real and full and genuinely yours, but you are at the beginning of it rather than the middle. And the beginning requires honesty that the middle can sometimes defer. It requires looking at what the pattern produced and what it cost and making a decision about who you want to be now with that information fully in view rather than carefully managed. The women who gave you the framework that produced the pattern called it support. They called it empowerment. They called it the liberation of a woman finally living on her own terms. What they gave you was permission without information, validation without clarity, the comfortable version of a conversation that should have been the true version. I chose differently. Because you are worth the true version. You always were. This is Miss Anna, and I will be back with more of what nobody else will say. Subscribe if you are ready to keep hearing it.